Hey everybody, if you're into archery, then you already know that targets for practicing can cost a lot of money, and the bigger they get, the more they cost. Well, today I'm going to show you how to build a great big target like this one, using only 2 tools and very little money, or possibly even for free if you're even halfway good at scrounging materials. All of the materials for this target are either scavenged old junk or remnants of new materials that I'd bought for a completely different project. So in essence, this target was completely free to me. Now even if you can't scavenge enough parts to put one of these together, the new material cost is relatively low. All you're going to need is 4 2x4s, which should cost you about $3.50 a piece, and 1 full 4x8 sheet of some kind of sheeting material to wrap around the outside. I used 1/2 inch OSB here, and a sheet of that is between $16 and $18 right now. So even if you have to go and buy new materials, after you throw in a handful of screws, the total cost of this thing is really only $35, and that's something we can probably all afford if we can afford a nice fancy bow. So that's enough blather, let's get into it.
Several years ago, I put out a video about this very same project, how to build a cheap or even free archery target. Well, that video did very well and it got tons of views, but there were a shocking number of people with no imagination who got mad at me for calling it a free target. You see, I intended to demonstrate a way that the target could be built and hope people would use whatever tools they had available to them to get the job done. Well, I run a small woodworking business, so I have access to lots of tools, and these unimaginative people didn't seem to think it was very fair of me to use them. Since I now need a new target, I figured it was time for an updated video, and to make the trolls happy, I'm only going to use 2 tools to do it. In order to keep this a true 2-tool project, I quickly made myself a speed square by attaching a narrow piece of scrap plywood to the edge of another piece that had a corner I knew to be square, or at least close enough to it. With my speed square, I could mark the lengths of my material, then draw a perpendicular line to use as a reference when cutting. This keeps my materials as square as possible when cutting them freehand. In the case of the 2x4s, I ended up making 36-inch square frames, which means I needed 4 cut at 36 inches and 4 at 33 inches. This brings us to tool number 1. I'm using a circular saw, but a jigsaw or even a reciprocating saw would do the trick if that's what you have. After using my straightest 2x4 to draw a reference line at 15 inches down the length of my OSB, I cut along it as carefully as I could and repeated the process until I had all 4 side panels ripped to width. Then, I used my speed square to mark the lengths and made those cuts as well. The OSB, or plywood, or whatever your sheet material happens to be, needs to wrap around the 2x4 frames. So in my case, I needed 2 cut at 36 inches and 2 at 37 inches. This accounts for the 1/2 inch thickness of the OSB. With everything cut to size, I started the assembly process. Tool number 2 is an impact driver, and with that in hand, I butted one of the shorter 2x4s up against the end of a longer one and ran in 2 screws. I didn't bother with pre-drilling the holes because that would just add another tool to the mix, and I didn't want to upset anybody. About my only real cost in this build are the screws I'm using to hold everything together. The self-tapping variety makes it much easier to drive them home without pilot holes. I attached the other short board to the opposite end of the long one, then attached the second long board across the remaining ends. You can see these 2x4s are a bit crooked and warped, but that doesn't really matter because they will be pulled square enough when I wrap the sheeting around them. I repeated the process for the second frame, then moved on to attaching the target faces. For this target, I'm using an old vinyl event banner for my faces. For my last target, I used an old grain sack, and I honestly think that was a better choice. But I had this on hand and I wanted to give it a try this time. Whatever you use, you want it to last as long as possible. So anything with a weave pattern will be your best bet because the material tends to part around the arrow, then seal back up a bit when you pull it out. I stretched this out as tight as I could and I stapled it to the front of the frame just to get me started. Then I used a box cutter to trim away the excess material, then stretched and stapled the vinyl to the outside edge of the frame. Now I know what you're thinking.
But Mark, a staple gun? A box cutter? That makes 4 tools now and you promised we'd only need 2.
Well, don't fret. The staple gun just makes this part easier, but you could just as easily use screws to hold the banner in place. And as for the box cutter, if you can't come up with some kind of a knife, then this video just isn't for you anyways. At the corners, I cut diagonally outward, then folded one flap over the other and stapled them down to create a clean edge. It turns out that my workbench is also 36 inches high, so I set the first frame on end next to the bench and set the first side panel in place, then screwed it down. I flipped the frame over and attached a second panel the same way. I put the second frame in place between the panels, and this is where the warped 2x4 started to fight with me just a bit. I attached one side just fine, but I had to muscle the parts around on the last side to get the corners lined up before running in my screws. I rolled the box on its side and attached the bottom board. This is the slightly longer sheet that overlaps the ends of the side panels. While the target box is still empty and light enough to move around easily, I used some thick leftover deck paint that looks like brownie batter and rolled it onto the outside surfaces of the OSB sheeting. This will help the material last longer since the target is going to spend its life sitting outside in the elements. OSB is notoriously unwaterproof. If it's wet long enough, it will delaminate and start to come apart. But that being said, it takes the right conditions and a long time for that to happen. I made the first target in a relatively dry environment 4.5 years ago out of OSB and I never painted it. I gave it to a friend who still shoots it to this day. He's replaced the shot out faces and stuffed new filler into it, but the OSB is still holding up. As long as I was painting, I cut a bunch of my scraps into 2-inch wide strips, then coated them in some bright fluorescent orange paint. These aren't exactly necessary for this project, but it's an added feature that I like. I'll show you where these come into play in a little while. After the paint was dry, I attached some 2x4 scraps to the bottom to act as feet to hold the target up off the ground. This will keep the bottom from rotting away into the dirt, and it'll provide a place for bunnies to go hide so my dogs can chase them around the yard later, even though I keep asking them to give up that nasty habit. It's finally time to stuff this thing full of a material that's going to stop arrows, and there are all kinds of options here. A good friend of mine likes to use wool because his family has access to sheep and he can get all the discarded wool he wants for free. It does a great job, but it can make your target heavy, and most of us don't have access to free wool. Another common filler is fabric. If you look hard enough, you can probably find enough old clothes and blankets to fill this thing up. Again, this option works well, but it's also heavy, and if water does find a way inside, your old t-shirts are going to suck up that water and never dry out again, leading to more weight and a potentially smelly mold problem. If you do use fabrics, make sure you cut the hard objects out like buttons and zippers. You wouldn't want something inside your target that could damage your carbon arrows. My preferred fill is used pallet wrap. This stuff is basically just industrial strength cling wrap, like the stuff you cover your hot dish with before you throw it in the microwave. When you pack it tightly, it stops arrows almost immediately because of its clingy nature, and it's very lightweight and it doesn't hold moisture. Look for local companies that do a lot of shipping and receiving. They are usually happy to find someone who's willing to take this stuff off their hands. A final option is to just use heavy plastic sheeting. Think landscaping plastic or garbage bags or the stuff Dexter uses to keep his kill rooms clean. No matter what material you use, you're going to need to pack it down way tighter than you think. When you're gathering supplies, get as much as you think you need, then double it, then double that amount again. You're going to use way more than you can believe is possible. With the target stuffed to the gills, I sealed it off by attaching the top. Now for those orange strips, you can imagine that there's 2x4s hiding around the outside edge underneath the vinyl, and if you put an arrow into those, it's going to be hard to get that arrow back. I like these orange strips to sort of indicate a no-shoot zone. Plus, it covers up the edges of the OSB sides, and frankly, it just looks good. Now at this point, I'd say you're done building. But I decided to make mine one step more complicated by adding a set of wheels that I took off an electric clay pigeon thrower. I bolted the wheels to the bottom of the foot, then started making a supporting foot for the opposite side. I also used up a bunch of my scraps by creating a retractable tongue so that I could pull this thing around the yard behind a lawnmower or a four-wheeler. This part is unnecessary, but it is really convenient. I attached a handle to the front edge, then rolled the finished target outside. I marked the locations of some aiming points on both sides of the target, then used a cardboard stencil and my fluorescent paint to spray on some nice clean circles. To prove that this thing actually works, I drug it across the yard and started shooting from 20 yards to demonstrate how well it stops arrows. The plastic inside makes for easy one-handed removal, and the arrow only penetrated about 1/4 of the shaft length. For one more test, I stepped up to nearly point-blank range. To put some numbers on it, I'm shooting my bow at just under 65 pounds with a 440 grain arrow. I got 8 1/4 inches of penetration in the center dot, which is about an inch more than going halfway through. It's going to be a long time before this thing gets shot out enough that my arrows start poking through the opposite face.
Well, if you watched this whole thing, it probably means you're into archery. So you might want to go over to my other channel, Gunflint Outdoors, because I just put up a video about an archery elk and mule deer hunt I just went on with my friends in the mountains of Wyoming. We had all kinds of fun, and man, did I miss being up there. So I'll drop you a link to make it really easy to find. And let me know what you think. Let me know what you thought of that video and this video. And that's about it. Thanks again, guys.